So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this public event jointly organized by ELIAMEP, better or less well known as Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy, and the Princeton Seeger Center for Hellenic Studies and the Princeton Athens Center, with the support of Delphi Economic Forum and the Friends of Gennadius Library. So it's a long list of organizations associated with this event. Dimitri Hondikas, who is the director of the Princeton Athens Center, at the same time director of the Seeger Center, is unfortunately not able to join us tonight. He's at Princeton for the commencement, I understand. And he sends his greetings. This is part of a growing collaboration between ELIAMEP and Princeton in Athens. We are grateful for the support of the Sarbanes Fund for the organization of this event. As I'm sure you all know, Paul Sarbanes was not only a well-known US Senator of Greek origin, but also an alumnus of Princeton University. And it so happens that the Kotzen Hall, which is hosting us tonight, is named after another famous Princeton alumnus, Lloyd Kotzen, who contributed a great deal to the promotion of classical studies at Princeton, but also here in Athens. So welcome all. So let me say a few words about our two speakers. Anne-Marie Slaughter and Andy Moravcsik I've known for a few decades. They're good friends, and I'm delighted to welcome them both here in Athens. They are two prominent US intellectuals and academics with a strong policy experience, which is not common. And furthermore, there are two US academics and intellectuals with deep knowledge of Europe as well, and with strong European roots. So I'm delighted to have them here to discuss elections in the United States and the European Union. What are the stakes? I will be doing most of the asking, and they will be doing most of the answering, for the very simple reason is that I'm part of the furniture here in Athens, so you know me, and there's no point in expounding my views, you know them, so it's more interesting to listen to Anne-Marie and Andy. Two words about both of them. They are also a formidable couple, I should say, not always agreeing about everything, at least on intellectual issues. Anne-Marie Slaughter is the president and CEO of New America, which is one of the leading American think tanks based in Washington, D.C. She is the former head of policy planning at the State Department under Hillary Clinton. She was the dean of the Princeton Center, is it? Princeton School of Global International Policy, and also the former head of the, let me see, what was it? The former head director of International Legal Studies at Harvard Law School. So, not an unimpressive CV. And Andy Moravcsik is Princeton. He's a professor of politics and public policy. He's also the director of the EU program in the Liechtenstein Institute at Princeton University, and with also strong policy experience in the US and also in Europe, Germany, notably. So these are the two people I will be discussing, European and American elections, inevitably with more emphasis on the US side, because after all, American elections in November are much more important, we have to confess, being in Europe, but still much more important than the European elections in June. So let me start with the first question to both of you. Us, as Europeans, we are rather shocked, we've been shocked in recent years, to witness how much US politics and US society have become polarized. Is this real? Is it a mirage? If it is real, how do you explain? How do you explain this almost unprecedented degree of polarization, at least something we haven't experienced for decades. Anne-Marie, would you like to start?
Lucas, yes, it's on. Yes? So thank you. And Loukas is being modest. Without Loukas Tsoukalis, neither Andy nor I would have ever made our career studying European Union politics. I studied with Loukas in Oxford in the early 1980s. I was half Belgian, and I wanted to study the European Union, and it was not exactly a hot topic, but Loukas was teaching it at Oxford, and Andy, whom I did not know then, studied European politics, EU politics. Of course, it was European Community politics then, at the School of Advanced International Studies in the mid-'80s. And we did not know each other, but when we met each other later and fell in love, we were on a train to Brussels, and we looked down and we said, or I said, "That's Loukas Tsoukalis." And Andy said, "That's Loukas Tsoukalis." And we looked at each other and said, "How do you know Loukas Tsoukalis?" So the shared love of Europe and the real commitment, not just interest in, but commitment to the European project, which is part of why we're so happy to be here. And I just have to thank many of you for extraordinary hospitality. Loukas and Maria Logothetis on IDRA this weekend. Couldn't get a better introduction to Greece than that, although we've both been here before. But also to all the staff of ELIAMEP who've really been marvelous in bringing us here, and particularly Martina Meidani, who has managed all the logistics. And I also do just want to thank Penny and Kalisa Apostolidis and the RACAP Foundation for hosting us in real style, right next to the Acropolis. You can't get a warmer welcome than that. So thank you. And now that I have delayed for a while, I will turn to your question. So the United States is deeply polarized. It is not amplified. It is worse than, I think, Americans, certainly over our lifetime, but even those Americans who will tell you we've been deeply polarized in the past, and of course we fought a civil war, this is very bad. And there are many reasons. Certainly the internet, the fracturing of the news we watch, we inhabit different worlds. If you are a Republican who watches Fox, you think the American border is a site of criminal carnage. If you are a Democrat and you watch CNN or MSNBC, you recognize that, yes, there are criminals who cross the border, but there are far more asylum seekers, and the system itself is broken and needs to be fixed. But you're inhabiting different worlds. Economically, yes, and Andy will talk more about that. Just the enormous inequality that we've seen since the 1980s is a huge factor. But I want to emphasize something I think Europeans don't pay enough attention to. I run an organization called New America. We are seeing a new America being born. That is true in terms of the technology. That's true in terms of our relationship to the world for a variety of reasons. But the most important factor is that Americans right now under 25, there is no white majority. So I want you to think about that, because think about what that would mean in Greece. All of our history since 1776, we've been roughly 80% Caucasian. White is a term defined in many different ways, but European American. And now, by 2027, Americans under 30, there will be no Caucasian majority. And by 2040, that will be all of the United States. It'll be roughly 49% European American, 30 to 35% Hispanic American, and the rest Asian American, African American, that's traditional African Americans, and a new African diaspora from Nigeria and Ghana and Ethiopia, and of course Indian American, East Asian. That is an unbelievable change. For the next 250 years, when you say, I'm American, there will be no presumption that you are of European stock. So that is creating huge social turbulence. It's not as simple as just racism. It is dramatic change in who you see as your country people, what the customs are, what the food is, and increasingly a sense that for many people, the country they know is being really irrevocably changed. So I will give you those factors and turn it to Andy.
Andy.
So the question you might want to ask is why this polarization seems to have so much larger political effects in the United States and secondarily the UK than it does elsewhere. Elsewhere it's troubling, but you don't see the same tremendous foreign policy swings as a function of that. And one important reason that people talk about less, I think, is the nature of the political institutions. So the United States, the United Kingdom, and Hungary are the three countries in the world that have de facto majoritarian political institutions. That is, they have single-member districts, each of which casts votes, elects their representatives. You don't have proportional representation, and you also don't select candidates in the United States and the UK by a very broad process that's centralized in the party. In the UK, it's the party members who are a very small group. In the United States, it's actually primaries in each district. And the result of this is that you essentially generate a two-party system. It's very hard to generate third, fourth, fifth parties the way you do in Europe with that kind of system. And the effect of that is to change the incentives for the critical group who transforms what is actually a relatively small radical right faction in the United States, like everywhere else, maybe 20% of the population, 15, change that into a ruling majority. And that is moderate Republicans, moderate conservatives in the United States. Their incentives are very different than they are in, say, a country like Germany. In the United States, if moderate Republicans don't go along with the Trumpian Republicans, the Democrats take over, right? In Germany, if the CDU party, the moderate right, doesn't go along with the far right, then you form another grand coalition with the SPD in the center. And that's not as bad an outcome. And so when you look at the moderate right in the United States, for us, the question is always, why don't these people stand up to the Trump people? And the answer is because we have designed a political system that makes it extremely costly for them to do so. And then you add one more thing, thinking about it now, just this swath of maybe 25% of the American electorate, decisive, who support Trump, but are not Trump far-right cultural conservatives. These people often, if you talk to them, they'll say, well, I held my nose, but I voted for Trump. Okay, why? Because in the United States, we still have a large faction of people who really don't believe in the modern welfare state, don't believe in a state that taxes and spends and is responsible for these fundamental protection of individuals. And those people are voting on the basis of their pocketbook, not on the basis of their radical beliefs. And in my lifetime, I think the biggest change in American politics is not that we've seen the rise of the Trumpian right. It's been the solidification and greater self-confidence and greater organization of the libertarian moderate right. The people who are against high taxes, against social spending, but to an extent that no European country can really approach. And these are the people who are decisive. So when we ask all the questions we're going to ask, you know, what is Trump going to be capable of doing, or what are the political compromises that have to be struck, it's this group that you really need to focus on, because they're decisive in American politics. And they are the group that permits this polarization to express itself as real policy.
Okay, so Anne-Marie, you stressed demographics, and they talked about institutions, but you also mentioned the libertarian right. Sorry. Interesting question is, you only mentioned economic inequalities briefly. How important do you think is the factor of economic inequalities in the States in US politics? Because after all, what we've been seeing for decades, recent 30 to 40 years, is an extraordinary widening of income and wealth inequalities in the States, which has direct effects, but it also has indirect effects, because there are many people who can easily buy influence and power. What is the impact on the US political system of the capacity of a small number of extremely wealthy people to buy influence and power?
It's complicated. There's no question that the influence of money in elections has also steadily increased. I mean, in the 1970s, the Supreme Court was limiting the power of money, and all of that has been overturned, including the ability of corporations to spend unlimited amounts. So the power of the powerful in our political system has gotten steadily bigger. The sense of most Trump voters, and you see this in Europe as well, that an entire group of people have been left behind is also certainly there. So that's part of it. There is agreement on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, that the tech billionaires and the big tech platforms need to be reined in, that they have too much power. At the same time, it's not, I mean, Biden has actually done very well by, first of all, with the pandemic spending, and then the Infrastructure Act, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are all subsidies of lots of different things. Unemployment is down. Inflation is still there for sure, but not as bad as it was. And yet he doesn't get credit for the good things that happen. So yes, I think there's no question that that economic divide fuels populism, but it's not what happens in the economy. If you think of that as a steering wheel driving your polity, the steering wheel is no longer connected very well to the electorate. So you'll have people who say, yes, we recognize that the macroeconomics are good, that the country is growing, that, again, the unemployment is extremely low, but my life hasn't changed enough. And that's not just because other people have gotten richer. It's just somehow that's not translating into their quality of life in a way that then translates into votes. Another way to put that is the cultural issues are more important. I mean, the biggest factor for the Democrats this year will not be the economic policies of Biden. It will be the striking down of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court and this sweep of laws trying to eliminate abortion completely down to 6 weeks in many states. That will galvanize Democratic voters. And on the other side, various social issues like immigration on the Republican side.
Okay, Andy?
So, you know, the conventional view about the effect of inequality is that it creates a dissatisfied group among the lower classes, and this dissatisfied group then expresses its dissatisfaction with the economic circumstances by adopting radical cultural positions. There is a considerable amount of statistical, social scientific, polling evidence to suggest this is true. But in the United States context, I don't think it's the most important thing. It's not that, you know, people who would otherwise vote for Bernie Sanders go over and vote for the cultural right. It's again, this moderate Republican, moderate conservative group. When inequality gets greater, it's not just the people who are disadvantaged by that who change their political behavior. It's the people who are advantaged. And in the United States, we have a lot of people who have been advantaged now for 50 years, right? It was Ronald Reagan, I think the most important election of my lifetime, the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, that began this process of cutting taxes, of reducing, and also criticizing the state, and the spread of a kind of libertarian ideology about what the ideal society is that basically didn't exist when I was a child in the United States. And once you allow that kind of a group to form over 50 years, it's very difficult to get rid of them. The truly cynical view by people like my colleague Paul Pearson at Berkeley and Jacob Hacker at Yale is that, in fact, much of the money to support far-right activities, including the mobilization of people around cultural issues, comes from the wealthy libertarians who are trying to create this coalition between the cultural conservatives and the economic conservatives. But even if you're not that cynical, this is a block, a voting block in the United States that will be extremely difficult to get rid of. And that makes me pessimistic, because if it were just that Trump has some crazy cultural beliefs, you might believe that, well, demographic change or just change in fashion or economic good times will make that better. But it will not change the economic policies that the center right pursues, and isolating them, pushing them to a smaller position in American politics will be very, very difficult.
Okay. Now let us move on to discuss the stakes. I mean, to put it rather provocatively, do you think that American democracy is in danger?
I do. And I say that with a heavy heart, and particularly here, with the Parthenon not too far away, and the sense, certainly that I grew up with, that democracy started here. I think, for a number of the reasons I cited, the underlying polarization is deep, and Trump is a symptom. I mean, he certainly made it worse, but if there hadn't been Trump, there would have been somebody else. And you actually saw that as various people there were people in the early parts of this election who were trying to out-Trump him in terms of their views. But I'm worried in two ways. In the short term, if you read the 900 pages that the Heritage Foundation has put out about what they want to do, because unlike last time when Trump did not expect that he would win, this time he's prepared, his people are prepared. And a lot of what is in that program would be familiar to autocrats in many places. You start, for just one example, he wants to put in something called Schedule F, which would effectively mean that rather than having a government as we do now, where most of it is civil service, bureaucrats who work for their lifetime in the government and uphold the values of the bureaucracy, and then we have about 10% political appointments, he would make that a much bigger chunk, political appointments. And you are going to see a lot of civil servants retiring. That means then, and again, there are suggestions of this, he can go after organizations like mine, who we're independent. We're not a Democratic or a Republican organization, but we've certainly taken many positions that he would not like. And he can challenge our tax status, right? He's already said he thinks the Justice Department, it should not be independent. It should go after his enemies. And you take the Internal Revenue Service and other parts of government. So I really do think, there's a high likelihood of political violence if he does not win or if it's close. And there could be violence on the other side too. I think you have to, and many of us are preparing for that. And then really the use of the government against us. I mean, I would not have believed that the things that happened over the last administration, starting with the press or the enemy of the people and just getting worse, would have happened. So I'm worried in the short term. And in the long term, I believe unless we can reform our political system, we simply don't have a system that can accommodate the diversity of the country we're becoming. And we don't have a way of creating parties so that you can actually get a balanced coalition, which then just makes the polarization worse and worse. So yes, I mean, I believe we'll survive it. I'm the optimistic idealist of the couple. So I
was hoping that Andy would provide a more optimistic view.
No, but I think I think you have to be worried, and you have to work very hard for the kind of reforms we need to thrive as the country we're becoming.
Another example, universities. So universities are independent in the United States, relatively powerful, wealthy institutions, and tend to lean left. Not nearly as radically left as the, lurid newspaper stories about wokeness make you believe. Most of the kids I teach at Princeton, want to go to work for Goldman Sachs or something like that.
Well-known communist organizations.
So, they're really quite moderate people. But the universities as a whole, as an independent source of knowledge, as a socializing device for students to a kind of diverse environment where you have students from all over the world and of all different, backgrounds in one place, is a threat to the Republicans, and they will go after universities. There's no question. They already have. So it's another example of this kind of semi-independent institution in most societies that will now come under great political pressure. I would say also the point about political reform is key. Again, imagine if the United States had a multi-party system. We would have, more than two. We would have a Trump party over here. We would have a Bernie Sanders party over there. We would have the kind of Joe Biden people here. We would have a kind of a, middle of the road business party here. We might have a couple of, maybe a Green party. And then they would form coalitions, and it would water down that kind of polarization. But in the U.S., without that kind of reform and without the prior reform of how you choose candidates or how you deal with money or other things that are really fundamentally different about American politics from most countries, it's a pretty bleak picture.
So there is some good news. I can't let you ask another question without. So you are seeing that kind of political reform at the city and state level, and it is gaining power because so many Americans worry about our democracy, and so many Americans really feel that we've got to have big change. That 20 years ago, if you talked about proportional representation in various ways, you'd have had people just staring at you strangely. Now, lots of cities and a growing number of states have that on the ballot, and there are lots of bright spots at the more local level. So it isn't all dark. It's just you have to be, you can't take anything for granted.
I just wanted to warn Andy that when he talks about coalition politics, and about compromise, he's in a country which doesn't believe in coalition politics, and compromise is a rather dirty word in the Greek vocabulary. Having said that, next question is, you painted a rather dark picture of the future. Now, what about foreign policy? Is there really much difference on the main tenets of foreign policy in the United States? After all, there seems to be bipartisan support about China. If there's one thing that unites most people in the Congress, is the fear of the emergence of China as a superpower, and that one should resort to every possible means to stop this from happening. Both administrations have this bad habit of levying tariffs against everybody. So the US is becoming more protectionist. Again, I'm playing the role of the agent provocateur, but you don't mind me doing that. Okay, so protectionism is rising. So apart from the rhetoric, Trump is good in rhetoric, but if one leaves rhetoric aside, is there a fundamental difference in foreign policy between the two?
He's going to start.
Okay. It's always hard to predict the future, but there are facts about the past and present that I think most people would agree with. One is that Trump, when it comes to actually concrete, consequential action, didn't achieve that much in foreign policy in his first 4 years, not as much as people feared, and often in an opposite direction than people feared. Yes, the killing of the Iran deal was an important act, although actually all Republicans agreed with that, and so did the Senate. when they passed it, all the Republicans in the Senate, so it's less of a break than maybe we think. The Chinese tariffs are real, but as Loukas points out, bipartisan. I mean, really bipartisan in the United States. Anti-China policy, in both in economic and security, is almost universal in the United States political, atmosphere. So, the optimistic story is that Trump's more of a talker than he is a doer. The people in that radical coalition that he has to keep together really care about how he acts, how he talks, but they don't care so much about what the policy is. In fact, they don't always even know what the policy is. And they're long-term, stable interests, business interests primarily, but also the foreign policy elite that can keep him in check. And I don't believe, as some people do, that the only way he was kept in check before was by the adults in the room who would steal papers off his desk and slow walk things and block him in secretive ways. By the end of Trump's first 4 years, he had the people in power across most of the foreign policy jobs that he wanted, the same kind of people that are going to go in now. So that's the positive story, is that he neither has an incentive nor a track record of that big a change. It's obnoxious to deal with, but the consequences aren't that great. But if you look at the 800 or 900 pages from the Heritage Foundation and you look at the people who he's selected, it's clear that he intends to push forward more firmly. I'll leave that to Emery, how that's going to go. But really the truth is nobody knows. And I think, consistent with what I said before, it really depends on Congress. It's going to depend on how much opposition comes, particularly from elsewhere in the Republican Party, to really pursuing a radical agenda on things like NATO or trade or other things.
So I think there are 3 big changes that you should prepare for. The first will be, well, 3 big ones and then not clear. But the first is Ukraine. This is already, we've already seen this, right? That the Republicans could not, were trying everything they could to block aid to Ukraine. They're already taking marching orders from him. And we know this because we almost had an immigration deal that had been negotiated between a conservative Republican senator and a Democrat, and it got torpedoed when Trump, the candidate, said, I don't want it. So you're already seeing the opposition to increased aid for Ukraine. And honestly, the Biden administration got it through only because they were able to tie it to aid to Israel. If you had not had that package, I don't think it would have gone through, which was really a shock, because as of December, we were both in Germany all fall, and I had an interview with a German magazine, and I said, oh, no, the aid to Ukraine will go through. There's bipartisan support. No. So that will change pretty dramatically. It's hard to know exactly how this will then play out, and of course, Europe has a huge role there. But it is likely that Trump may put pressure on Zelensky or may simply agree tacitly with Putin in ways that will make a settlement or a pressure for a settlement much more likely. And that then is obviously going to affect Europe enormously. On the Middle East, I think it's less clear. If you read what Trump says, it looks like he'll say to Netanyahu, you can have Israel from the river to the sea, but obviously he's not in the position to make that happen. And he's had very close relations with Saudi Arabia. So I think that one's a much harder one to call. But there are 2 other factors that I think are less obvious, but very important. One, Trump does not believe in diplomacy. Right? He does not believe in coming together with other countries and forming coalitions, except on the most transactional basis. So the Biden administration has really spent 4 years building coalitions of many different kinds and still exercising American leadership with other nations. It's no longer just dictating, but that's been very important in everything from North Korea, obviously, to China, to the Middle East, in Africa on various issues. And that will change. And that will leave Europe as the believer in diplomacy. And that's going to be an unusual place, and a place where Europe is going to have that much more pressure to make massive reforms in the EU to allow Europe to play that kind of leading diplomatic role. And the last point, Trump does not support the EU. And he is much more likely to make a common cause with those members of the EU, from Orban to other right-wing parties, who will say, yes, we'll still have the European Union, but it'll be a very different European Union. It will be an expanded European Union with far less central powers. It may be that U.S. support for a strong European Union isn't that important, but we may find out what happens when it's withdrawn.
Well, you spoke about Europe, and we have the pivot to Asia. It goes back to Obama. You talked about demographics, and demographics will at some point affect foreign policy. I mean, the US population will be less Eurocentric than it has been for centuries. Thus, it's bound to translate into a different US foreign policy, which means that we Europeans should expect less interest from Washington in European affairs unless Putin obliges by being nastier or even continuing to be as nasty as he has been. Two questions. Should we really prepare for the US continuing to be less and less interested in Europe, number one? And number two, can you explain a bit more, what is it that makes Trump dislike the EU so much? Because it's not only that he likes the kinds of Orban, Le Pen, Salvini and the rest. He seems to have a gut reaction against the EU. Is it my impression or is it true?
Let me go on this one. So on the first one, yes, no matter what happens in this election or the next election, think back to what I said about the demography. When 30 to 35% of the American population has come from Mexico, Central America, and Latin America, those people will look south just as European Americans have looked east. It's not anti-European. It's just that's where you come from. That's where your economic ties are. That's where your cultural ties are. Now, you can look at the transatlantic relationship, not only Europe, United States, but also Africa, Latin America, and of course, from Europe, those are the origins of Latin America as well. So there are things you can do. But the assumption that my generation and 20th century Americans have made that we are of European stock, that yes, we revolted against England, but France was there to enable our revolution, that is our closest allies, that will not automatically continue. Europe will have to make the case that the world is better off and the US is better off with a strong European alliance. But that's not going to be just reflexive. That's going to have to be because of what Europe brings to the table. In terms of why Trump doesn't like the EU, Trump hates the UN. Trump hates anything that looks like supranational or global governance. And so does an entire wing of the Republican Party. And they have for a long time. I mean, Vandenberg in 1945, they were the isolationists. He was the one that actually said, no, actually, we do need to support some kind of global governance. So I think it's just reflexive. It's not hating Europeans per se. It's hating the EU.
Okay. Andy?
I have a slightly different view about Trump. I study what the far right does in power, and so went through every single Trump speech, every single biography of the administration. The funny thing about the EU is it never comes up. I mean, it comes up if you have to deal with them, but it's not like Trump fulminates against it. He fulminates against Mercedes driving around the streets of New York and those awful Germans who export them. I mean, my sense about his dislike for Europe is in his personal case, it comes from a kind of 1980s mercantilist sense of how trade policy works, that everybody's trying to sell everybody else things and we want to reduce our trade deficit, and these Germans are exporters and they're cheating. And I mean, he treats them kind of like they're the Chinese or the Japanese in the 1980s. But this dovetails with another strand in the Republican Party, which is those people who don't like the European Union because they view it like the Brexiteers viewed it, as a kind of regulatory, semi-socialist superpower, which is kind of odd if you know a lot about the European Union. But that is the view of many Americans, libertarians, that, you know, this stands for regulation. They very much take the Brexiteer view of what the EU is about. So that's why you get a relatively large swath in the Republican Party that's sort of Eurosceptic in a sense. But the question you'd have to ask yourself as Europeans is, how much is Trump willing to pay? I mean, how much political capital will he expend to do things like, you know, block the EU in something, or, for example, pull out of NATO? Ukraine for him is easy because the president can just block money. And even if ostensibly Congress gives that money, and if Congress were really united, they could force that money to be given to Ukraine, but they probably won't. So the president can block it. This is very different than pulling out of NATO. I mean, first of all, it's enormous institutional change in American military and foreign policy. Think about, the United States projects power everywhere. It's in everybody's business around the world. And some of those places are in Africa. Some of those places are in the Middle East. Some of those places are in Europe. And the United States has a very small military commitment compared to East Asia. In Europe, it has one carrier group, and it has about 25,000 soldiers and a bunch of airplanes. It also has the headquarters of the Africa division of the military. If a soldier gets shot up in Iraq, where does he get evacuated to? He gets evacuated to Ronstein in Germany, right? And I find it hard to believe that the United States will just say, okay, we're going to do all that from Virginia or Santa Barbara. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see Trump's particular political incentives to have it happen. I think Congress, it's one of those issues that Congress would probably take a stronger view on. So I think going issue by issue, you have to think, where does Trump really have a personal incentive and the political capacity to make change? And I think some of the big things people worry about, like pulling out of NATO, are less important. On the NATO front, though, for example, one thing he could do is, and he already has done, is talk down the Article 5 guarantee. Cheap for him. All he has to do is tweet, right? No political costs for that. And then you have to ask yourself, does that really, you know, will Putin say, oh, Trump has tweeted that I won't defend Estonia, so now I'm going in? Or would Trump still be worried that at the end of the day, the United States or somebody else would defend Estonia? So I think it's a more complicated calculation than people think. It's not as if Trump can just decide in each of these areas, I don't like these people, or I would prefer to live in some other world. And you see that when he had to deal with real constraints in the world. European responses to American trade pressure in the first administration. European fought back. And there's tremendous economic cross-investment across the Atlantic. So all of a sudden, he's getting stuff from Congress. He's getting stuff from business saying, don't do this. Look at Korea. You know, his original position was, we're going to pull all our troops out of Korea, let them defend themselves. We have no interest in that. 4 years later, everything's the same because there really isn't an alternative. So I think, you know, many of these things are more structurally determined in the sense that the United States has been dealt a hand in the world and it's playing it and will play it no matter what.
Okay, so you expect constraints on an eventual second Trump administration. I remember the then US ambassador to the EU, when Trump was elected, he told me that people from Trump's staff were phoning Brussels and asking which country is following the UK. And they were convinced that one country after the other will be leaving the EU. I remember, because Trump's election came a few months after the Brexit referendum. Now,
can I just give one example, though interesting example? So there's a big difference between Trump saying, you know, I really like Brexit, which he said a lot, and Trump helping the Brexiteers. He could have made Brexit a really viable proposition easily, and that would be to force rapid negotiation of a trade agreement with Britain, bilateral free trade with the United States. Instead, he dawdled, and then he said, yeah, we'll sign a trade agreement, but you know, you got to deal with this business about Airbus airplanes, and you got to deal with this business about chlorine chickens, and you got to deal with this other stuff, all of which was politically non-viable. There is no trade agreement today. And so I think there's a big difference between what people like this say and what they do. And that is, again, because the constituency for what they say is very different than the constituency for what they do.
okay, let us move on to discuss Europe a bit, if you don't mind. We have European Parliament elections in June, I mean next month. We expect a rise of the far right. We expect all the so-called systemic parties to lose, some more than others. Interestingly and depressingly, perhaps enough, we expect the Greens to lose quite a bit. And this is not terribly consistent with our ambitious Green Deal, to put it mildly. Now, how much worried are you about the rise of the far right in Europe? Are the stakes much lower? Because after all, European Parliament elections do not actually decide the executive in Europe. It's about legislators, and that's really the big difference between European Parliament elections and national elections anywhere? Or is it something that we should seriously worry about? Will there be more Orbans, Melonis, Wilderses, and others in Europe?
So Andy studies this, so he's going to give you certainly a more detailed answer. I mean, the first thing to say is, other than real foreign policy experts and aficionados of European politics, I don't think most people in Washington could really explain elections to the European Parliament and how they work and what the role of the European Parliament is. It's complicated in various ways. But what will be noted, I think, is if the far right parties, the supporters of those parties, if the elections come out the way you're predicting, the U.S. press will essentially say, will describe an increase in support for the far right across Europe that will then be tied to the support for Trump across the United States. And that I find worrying, in that if there is then a unified view, the Orban view of the EU, that the EU, as I said before, should not become stronger, should not have a fiscal union, should not actually, become a much more of a geopolitical power with its own defense capacity. Many of the things that a report that the European Conclave just issued, that as a strong Europeanist, I think is exactly what the EU does need to do. But if there's this view that, no, the EU should be more of a talking club, it should be more like a traditional international organization, then I find it very worrying, as with right before Brexit, this sense that these right-wing views, these extreme right-wing views, are becoming more mainstream across Europe, across the United States, possibly other countries. So I'm much more worried about the atmospherics and the overall sense of who has the momentum than I am about very specific changes.
Okay. It seems to me, I mean, listening to Trump and listening to Le Pen is the epitome of moderation compared with Trump. And I'm not mistaken, am I?
But this is not by chance. Okay, so there are two levels. There's a national level and the European Parliament level. The European Parliament traditionally has attracted a lot of protest votes. People cast protest votes, more radical votes, sort of votes of conviction for the European Parliament. But then when it comes to national politics, where they think real money and policy is at stake, they're less radical. And I do think that the overall impact of the European Parliament is not as large as the European parliamentarians would wish it was. It might have some effect on, for example, who gets to be the next Commission president, which could be an important thing. But and what's more, the European far-right parties are far from an agreement about foreign policy. In fact, there are relatively few that are really the large ones that are really outright anti-Russian. I mean, not the Poles, not the Italians, not the Swedes, and so on down the line. But at the national level, you know, these parties make functioning in a political system a lot more difficult. They make it, you know, more conflictual in certain ways, but their direct impact on policy is really remarkably small. Take the case of Mr. Wilders. Mr. Wilders wins an election. I mean, in the Dutch sense of winning election, which was 23%, but he wins an election, which gives him the right to form a government. Instantly, every other party says, no, you're not going to do that. Takes him 4 months to catch up to that. And then he says, okay, well, I'll be a junior partner. And then they say, well, that's okay. But then, you know, none of this stuff about pulling out of the EU. So Wilders gets quoted in the Financial Times saying, well, Dutch voters don't feel like pulling out of the EU. They said none of this about mosques, you know, and you go down the line and pretty soon Wilders is this, you know, little person essentially supporting a center-right. And then Mark Rutte, the current prime minister, gets quoted in the Financial Times saying nothing will change in the new government. And that is typical. That's what happened in Austria. That's what happened in Finland. That's what happened in Estonia when these parties come into power. And the smart people, like Maloney, who is very savvy, says, oh, well, so if I want to actually lead a coalition, I have to moderate. And she moderates to a almost entirely centrist position on foreign policy. Le Pen is 2/3 of the way there now. You know, you still have ambiguity on Russia, but on many other things, you know, particularly the European stuff, has changed her tune. So, and I don't think this isn't what they believe or what they want or something is not the point. It's what is possible for them in a political system designed the way theirs is designed. And because of this enormous moderation effect, it becomes countries like the US and the UK that I worry about, where you have this majoritarian tendency to weaken the moderates in the system over time.
We were discussing in Florence on Friday, Europe, and I argued in favor of Europe thinking power and not just peace project. Do you honestly think there are many Americans who are prepared to put up with that?
Put up with it, meaning?
The idea of Europe acting as a power and the idea of having an Atlantic alliance where there is a European defense pillar and there is more symmetry, not only in terms of burden, but also in terms of responsibilities.
I do, actually. I really do. I think most Americans believe that there's just no way Europe can do it. And honestly,
probably right.
But you know, when I was studying European community politics with you, I'm not sure we would have believed 1992 or the Maastricht Treaty or the Euro or any of the things that Europe has done. And I always point out to Americans, Europe is young. Europe, you know, is founded in 1957. I mean, when we were Europe's age, we were more or less having a civil war. So, and let us hope that is not Europe's trajectory. But so I think most Americans don't believe the EU can do it. But if the EU could do it, I think for a number of reasons. A, the United States believes, and I think believes accurately, that if China really is the threat that many Americans see it as, I'm I think we have to pay close attention and careful attention to China, but I'm less of a hawk than many. Then the world the United States will be far better off with a strong Europe. We do in the end believe, Trump aside, that this is a coalition of democracies and a coalition also of capitalist states, and that we will be better off together. I also do think at this point that Americans think there are a lot of issues in the world, and this is again tied to the demographic change, right? That there are a lot of issues in the world, in the Middle East. Remember, both Obama and Trump wanted out of the Middle East, that are more in Europe's backyard than ours, and we should not be the global policeman. I mean, there's no support for that on the left or on the right. So I really do think if Europe were to say, look, we have our own defense capacity, we are playing the economic and political role in the world that our size and our technical capacity allows, the United States would be okay with that. The place that the United States would really not be prepared for, and we have not talked about it at all, is technology. Right now, Europe is regulating digital technology and artificial intelligence, but not actually producing it. Your report and others say, and I believe strongly, Europe is not going to be able to continue regulating unless it becomes a technological power in its own right. That the U.S. would really have a problem with.
Okay. Yeah, I think that last point is the key takeaway. So if you don't, right now we're all mesmerized by Ukraine and the fact that policy decisions have to be made in the short term, and Trump looks like he might not make the right ones and so on. And then on the back of that comes this issue of defense spending. I neither think that substantially greater defense spending for Europe's a good idea, nor do I think it's the important issue of the 21st century. The important issue of the 21st century in this kind of global politics is going to be a kind of quasi-mercantilist economic competition that has a strong regulatory dimension. And so what really gets American political system and diplomatic system riled up, and a bunch of lawyers from Google riled up, is when you say, okay, we're going to start regulating tech. And it also, however, gets the respect of Americans. I mean, a lot of those people from Google will say, oh, the European Union, a bunch of countries, they don't do anything, the Europeans don't have any of this and that. And then if they manage to regulate something, all of a sudden they go, this is terrible what they're doing, right? That is it. And I don't think the United States has a particular incentive to significantly change the geopolitical military status quo with Europe. I don't think China wants to march over here. The Russian threat, I think, also is limited. It's kind of hard to imagine Putin prevailing in Ukraine and then conquering Romania and then conquering Poland and conquering Brandenburg and showing up in Berlin. So so you say, what's the conflict going to be about? It's going to be about productivity, it's going to be about trade, it's going to be about investment, and it's going to be about regulation. And so the number one question for the middle part of the 21st century is going to be, can Europeans regulate in a way to maintain a European society, a society that meets European ideals in that sense, in the face of having basically in many areas two options, the Chinese option and the American option. Can Europe stand up? And that, Anne-Marie and Loukas are both right, it's very hard to do that if you don't have the productive capacity to back it up. Yeah. So this is the question I would be spending money on, thinking about diplomatically, preparing yourself for. And even Trump is, when it comes right down to it, he has sort of woolly and somewhat incoherent political military ideas, mostly kind of isolationist, which isn't the worst thing. But he has very clear mercantilist ideas, and he always has for 30, 40 years. So that's the ball to keep our eyes on.
I just have to say for the record, though, I disagree on the military spending. I think Europe does need to spend more militarily, and yes, the scenario with Russia seems unlikely, but the half Belgian in me says you really do need to be prepared to defend yourselves, and that this is not a mistake we can afford to make. In other words, we cannot afford to underestimate what could happen with Putin, in my view. And Europe is going to need to be able to defend itself, because we will not always be there.
Yeah, there's one point perhaps that Trump is right. This is when he accuses the Europeans of being free riders on defense, and he has a point. Now, I shouldn't monopolize the questions. So who would like to come up with, not comments, please, but short questions addressed to our two American friends? Please, Elena Lazaru. There's a microphone coming. No, I think...
Here it comes.
Okay. It's here.
Thank you very much.
Can you please just quickly identify yourself?
My question will be about the European Parliament. I have a Trump-related question and a non-Trump-related question. Trump-related. Indeed, as you have said, Biden has gone on to make alliances, which is really not the Trump model. However, some of these alliances can be seen as very transactionalist and very much tools for China-proofing. I'm thinking here of the Quad. I'm thinking even of the Trade and Tech Council with the EU. I'm thinking of the IREC and other alternative corridors for transportation infrastructure in Asia. What do you think Trump will do with those? Because they actually make sense with his China policy. Will he modify them, keep them, completely reject them as Biden products? So that's my Trump question. And really quickly on the demographics, because I think it's a really important point, and I think everyone in Europe is thinking about it. But what always strikes me is the non-white Americans actually have so much in common with the Europeans in terms of values and in terms of social justice and equity and protection of minorities and human rights. So why is that message not getting across? Because I can hardly think of a place other than Europe that aligns in terms of human rights aspirations with that demographic. So something is bad in the communication.
I'll take the second. Take the first. Okay. So on the second, this is a very important point. So, and again, let me start by saying, though, the Democrats have long assumed that voters of color will vote Democratic. That is not true. And you are seeing, right, and for one thing, it was never going to be true. If you think about Catholic culture of Hispanic Americans, this is a conservative culture, and particularly among the men, they are voting for Trump, and they're increasing, and that's true among African American men as well. So it was crazy and stupid politically to announce, oh yes, as soon as we become 50-50, the Dems will resurge. But you are right to say that among younger voters of color, I mean, Alexander AOC. I can't even think of Cortez, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez defines herself as a democratic socialist, which is astounding. The idea that you'd actually have a party in the United States that says we are democratic socialists, those are Europeans. And certainly on social values, that is where they are. Domestically. The minute you turn to foreign policy, Europe is the ultimate imperial power. And that's what they see. So when Obama comes to power and he says, and he looks at Britain, does he see, the staunch American ally, the special relationship? No, he sees the imperial power in Kenya, where his father is from. And so it's a really sharp divide. And you are seeing it, of course, right now in Israel-Palestine, because Europe is split, but you have many very strong pro-Israel countries, whereas with that generation, not at all. So I think that's why the message doesn't come through, because it isn't uniform. My advice with Europeans is that Europeans ought to be building up groups of young leaders who are new Europeans. You are not going to be 50% non-Caucasian anytime soon. But the Belgium that I grew up in and the Belgium today looks radically different. And the Netherlands looks radically different. And so does France. So honestly, there are a lot of Europeans who are, of course, from former colonies, but who are now European in the same way that we have Americans. And that's a transatlantic bond that Europeans have not done anything to foster.
But that's a very interesting point you made, and this is not usually understood by Europeans, because Europeans conveniently try to forget their imperialist and colonial past, which is not forgotten when you are on the other side of the fence. Andy.
So you're absolutely right that little will change in China policy in the United States. It really is amazingly, and not always for the better, maybe bipartisan in nature. But I think Europeans, and they don't like to do this generally, Europeans, but I think you have to decide, I'm dealing with a transactional guy, so I'm going to be transactional. So if Trump comes and says, okay, I don't want you to procure this, or I want you to deal in this kind of, you say, good, what's your price? What's it worth to you for us to do this? As I said before, retaliation against the United States in the trade dispute that took place under the first Trump administration actually worked pretty well. The tariffs on European products, even including the steel, were what, 1/30th? I mean, much smaller than they were on China. And there are lots of other areas where you need to think very carefully about how to do this. Arms procurement. So, the threat to America of European defense cooperation isn't that Europeans will be stronger in the world and able to defend themselves. We like that. It's that they won't buy F-35s. Because Macron will say, we want a European defense, but you're going to buy our French stuff, right? Right? That's going to be the deal. And Americans are going to go, whoa, 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 what about General Dynamics and Lockheed and those people? And that's going to be, so then you say to the Americans, well, pulling out of NATO, you got no chance for these contracts. Or to take a final example, if you want to put pressure on a lot of these issues, you send people from the countries that Trump likes, countries like Poland, right, Estonia, Ukraine, countries that have big political constituencies in the United States. And those countries are a very different set of countries than the countries that Europeans traditionally think of as being the important countries. Turns out Trump doesn't like Germans, fine, don't send the Germans, send the Poles. But you need to think about, I think, how this is going to go transactionally for 4 years, because it's going to be that kind of dealing.
I'll just say one other thing, though. I think a lot of the tariffs won't change. Things like the Quad, the difference is not that Trump would be fine that it's anti-China, but Trump doesn't like anything that's not about Trump. Right? So the way of working, that sort of behind the scenes, all those phone calls, all that pulling together, you don't see Biden grandstanding about the Quad. He will talk about it. Trump is much more likely to say, I'm going to make the deal with Xi, or I'm going to pull things together. So I doubt he will undo them, but I don't think they'll get the same kind of play that you see.
Okay. Let me take two questions, the gentleman and then thousands of enemies. First, you.
Yes, good evening. I'm Dr. Kallias. I'm the president of the Stanford Club of Greece. Sometimes the hardest questions are the easiest ones. Could we hope for some correspondence between the parties of, in the US and, in Europe? In our perceptions, is that the Democrats aligned remotely, partly with the left in, Europe? Where would the libertarians stand in the spectrum of the parties in Europe? Given, the subject matter of our elections, where would, the Republicans stand as a correspondence? If such a correspondence can be made, it would help sort of view these elections through a common prism, if such a common prism could be possible.
And then Thanos Veremis.
What I find extremely surprising is that although there is a reservoir of American voters, female voters, huge reservoir, one would have expected that all this time there would have been a kind of an explosion of female voices that dislike Trump for his macho style. And frankly, I can't think of a precedent in American culture, any populist politician being as atrocious in behavior to women than he. So I think this is really what makes him stand out. There have been other populists in American history, no doubt. It's full of populists. But even Huey Long never came up with as demeaning remarks as he has. Where are the women of the United States?
I'm not taking this question.
I'll do that. You take your first one.
Anne-Marie.
You want to take this? So it's a great question. So the first thing I will say is if Biden wins, American women will have elected him or re-elected him. There's no question that that is the key constituency in two ways. One, younger voters who probably otherwise wouldn't have voted, but women and some men also, but overwhelmingly women in all these other elections, and it is over abortion. It is not what he says, although they think he's despicable, but it is that really this is an extraordinary deprivation of rights that they had grown up to believe. But even a sort of more nuanced view of that is Hillary would have won, but white suburban women in the end went back and voted for Trump. White suburban women were outraged by what he said, but the James Comey letter refocused attention on her emails of all stupid things. And there was a lot of dislike of Hillary Clinton among those sort of independent suburban women, many of whom didn't like her, her original statement back in the 90s of, I'm not going to sit around and bake cookies. They thought that she was kind of contemptuous of women who stayed home. But the thing I will end on, because there's been some really interesting work on this, is why sort of independent women and even Republican women don't turn on him, because he's so horrifically macho, vulgar, just terrible. And there are two answers. One is, oh, he doesn't mean it. I'll leave that to you. But the other, which I find deeply depressing among particularly Republican women, is all men are like that. Only Trump admits it honestly. That is not from me, but that is what.
Oh dear.
Oh dear is right.
Yeah, women are key, but the electorate's made up of constituents. I mean, white people vote alarmingly, overwhelmingly for Trump, and then racial minorities make up that. Young people vote for the left, but elderly people who vote in greater numbers vote for the right. So it's a patchwork. U.S. parties and European parties. I mean, the U.S. political spectrum is strange. It's skewed to the right. It's only got two parties, so that we don't get to express desires for change except in the primary stage. So you see somebody like Bernie Sanders and you go, oh yeah, sort of a center-left social democrat. You recognize him in the European context. But in the general elections, that never appears. And so I think that it's very hard to draw clear comparisons between these political systems because the incentives facing parties are so different. And speaking as a political scientist, the biggest difference between the way political scientists view politics and the way normal people view politics, and I think we have a lot of empirical data on our side on this, is that normal people kind of think different people really, really want something, and then they vote for it, and then it happens if a lot of people want it. And political scientists think people are very structured by both prior cultural beliefs and things, and by the political institutions that channel what they can or even want to do. And so it's very difficult in a political system as strange as the United States system, with a history as strange as the American history, to say this is what's the same in Greece, except you have a broadly, left-right spectrum and cultural conservatives.
Okay. Two more questions at least. So the lady here, and then the gentleman over there. Ah, yes.
Shall I rise?
Whatever, sure. As long as we can hear it.
Okay. Thank you very much for this discussion. My name is Anni Podimata. I'm a former member of the European Parliament and former Vice President. So my question is addressing to the three of you. You mentioned, Loukas, Professor Tsoukalis, that you discussed power influence regarding Europe. You pointed out that Europe has to become stronger, has to become a power. And I think that Andy also endorsed that perception. So that means that Europe has to spend more for defense. Europe has to spend more for innovation, for technological innovation, for more production, for enhancing its competitiveness, which is getting worse and worse during the last years. And all this has to be decided on a more unified and centralized way. So we need a more unified decision-making, and we need much more unified spending, because if we're discussing about EU becoming a power, we don't speak about Germany or France or I don't know who else to spend more. We need Europe to spend more. How would it be possible with this political landscape that we are discussing, with this rise of extreme right and nationalist forces? And yes, Mrs. Meloni and even Marine Le Pen are becoming more modest and more mainstream, but still they have nothing to do with defense of the European project. My assumption is that this kind of direction is going to be extremely difficult for Europe, because it's not just the significance of the elections for the European Parliament, it's that the rise of the extreme right and the nationalist forces is also demonstrated in national elections during the whole 2023 elections in Italy, in Holland, etc., etc. So my assumption is that it's not going to be possible. And my question is, what would that mean for the transatlantic relations? How do you see the perspective of the relations between the US and the EU in the next couple of years? And in the end, the so-called Western alliance, based on principle and rules and values, etc., combined with what Anne-Marie described in the demographic changes in both continents, will still remain, or we will have fundamental changes also in this field? Thank you very much.
Shall we have a very quick response to this one and move on to the next?
Sure.
Who would like to start?
It's a very tough question, and I do think it is a pivotal moment for Europe in the way that previous crises have led to Europe looking and deciding either we're going to get stronger and more unified, or we're really going to risk what we've accomplished to date. And one would think that Russia on Europe's border, the first land war, all of that would be that crisis. And it may yet be particularly if the United States elects Trump, the question will be, and we were talking about this, will the French and Germans, maybe the French, Germans, and Poles, pull together as that motor? Because you need, a set of countries that believe very strongly and are willing to really make some sacrifices to do it. It is a critical moment. If that does not happen, I see, and if we elect Trump, I see decades of drift. I see decades of drift, and while we sort out our domestic problems, America first, America, a very different America, I see a multi-aligned world where many of the other middle powers, the Indias, the Brazils, the Indonesias, the Asians, are essentially saying we're going to pursue our own interests. I see, and we haven't even mentioned climate, which is really astounding until this moment, because that is an area where Trump will make a difference, although the states of the United States will make up some of it. But I see the lack of will there between Europe and the United States to make the kinds of compromises and leadership necessary. So yes, I see a drifting and a kind of period where you really can't see what is going to emerge, but that the biggest accomplishments of the 20th century, and I think the EU is one, and the American-led global liberal order, which was far from perfect, but better than nothing, both really get dramatically weakened, and we face global threats, climate most among them, that we're unable to meet.
So I think the traditional way Europeans solve this problem is worth a try. The evolution of the European Union is such that it was essentially bottom-up in the first years. That is, you had a set of things that some subset of countries had actually already done as a group, and it got generalized. And at some point, you said, as happened, for example, with the creation of the single market and Thatcher, look, either you join this or we'll do it without you. There was an agricultural union before there was the common agricultural policy. And the original philosophy of the European Union was this kind of, or European community, was this kind of integration by stealth from the bottom up. And I think that's the way it's going to have to go. And Loukas' report is very good on this. There are three markets that are not really integrated in Europe that are critical for having coordinated power in the 21st century: finance, tech, and defense. And if these are not integrated, then it's hard to imagine how everything else that you want to do, spending X hundred billion euros on investment and so on, is going to have the effect it should have. Now, what one has to hope is that you can find the political will to set in motion these bottom-up market-building things, and then create a situation in which you'll have a consensus. If you try to do it top-down, for example, just Europeans going to establish a policy on something and then drive the means to realize the policy that way, I think it will be politically blocked, and not just, or even primarily, by the far right. It will be blocked by the traditional national interests that have blocked this since time immemorial. So, and I think that's kind of the common denominator of the various plans that are out there now. The Letta plan, the plan Draghi is going to come up with, much of what Loukas' group did. And I think that's probably the best hope right now. Politically, it makes more sense, but also it recognizes the basic fact that at the heart of all of the things European Union wants to do, enlargement or defense or tech regulation, you're going to need greater economic coherence and productivity to make it happen.
Since the question was addressed to me as well, may I just say a few words? It seems to me that the way the world has changed in recent years requires a kind of adjustment for the European Union that is nothing short of the reprogramming of our collective DNA. Because you are trying to transform a peace project into an organization that thinks in terms of power. And that is reprogramming of the DNA. And that is extremely difficult to do. Interesting point, if you look at opinion polls, they all show that our citizens are far ahead of our political classes. All opinion polls show very clearly there's a strong majority of Europeans who want European common defense and a common European foreign policy, which doesn't happen. And my concluding remark would be difficult, almost impossible, though this reprogramming of the DNA is, unless Europe succeeds in doing much of that adjustment, there's one thing that's for sure, and that is Europe will become rapidly marginalized. It will become essentially irrelevant in a rapidly changing world. And European irrelevance means our total incapacity to defend fundamental interests and values. So it looks dismal, but I think this is the prospect unless we succeed in doing the change.
Could I just add one thing, which is I think one small piece of evidence that this assertion of power is something that can work for Europe is the success, despite all the criticism on accountability grounds, indeed because of it, of von der Leyen's Commission presidency. This is the most successful Commission president since Jacques Delors. And the reason is precisely because the reason she is so criticized in Brussels, not least in the parliament, is because she just went out and did things. But a lot of the things she went out and did in crisis situations were more effective than doing nothing, and probably wouldn't have been agreed in real time if countries had done it. So it does suggest there's capacity there to accept these kind of bold moves, if you can find a way to get there.
I think we are already getting past the... I have one more question from the gentleman over there, or perhaps two, as long as you make them very quick.
Hello, my name is Nikos Sofianopoulos. I'm a sustainability and carbon footprint expert. So, Mrs. Slaughter, you saved the talk by naming climate once in this thing, because what are the stakes? This is what I want to hear about. What will happen with dealing with the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis? Because if we don't do something really quick, maybe in 50 years, all this talk will be totally irrelevant. That's okay.
That's a strong point.
This guy in black.
Yes, well, the guy in black, whom I don't see, but...
Right here, right there.
Okay, the gentleman, yes? Yeah, you, please. That's the last question, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you for giving me the last question. My name is Mario Hatzdamnianos. I'm working in the aid industry as a cultural ambassador, and my question is, do you see a domino effect taking place between the association of the EU and the US in terms of the aid industry for developing countries, because climate change is really connected to what neighboring countries will be needing in the future and the role that both the EU and the US can play towards that direction? Thank you.
Who would like to start?
So on climate and biodiversity, and yes, I mean, I've just finished teaching a course at Columbia on global politics for people and planet, and I actually think most of those issues, particularly for younger people, are more existential than Ukraine or China. I mean, there's no question that if Trump is elected, he'll pull out of the Paris Agreement again, but that is less important than the fact there will be nobody like John Kerry who is actually trying to play that diplomatic role. Not that Kerry's been nearly as successful as they had hoped, but they have gotten quite a lot done, at least in terms of trying to build global coalitions and trying to ratchet up the Paris process. You won't have that, and the EU, honestly, is going to have to be the leader there. I remember in 2019, Lord Stern, the great British climate negotiator, and saying, you know, we can do this without you. We can't do this without your changes of your own emissions, but there Biden has put in a lot of the infrastructure already, and frankly, the sort of sense that we have to make our transition is taking hold. So for me, the biggest danger is the lack of the diplomatic support for Europe and push. And there, I do just think you have to look to the EU and lots of other developing countries as well. On aid, look, the best hope for the EU and the US aid industries is that it is anti-China for the US. That's the only thing that Trump is not going to lead trying to work in Africa in various ways, but if you sell it to him, and Mark Green was the USAID appointment before, it was a perfectly good appointment. You got the U.S. Development Finance Bank through. That was a good thing. So as long as that is billed as this is what we have to do to fight China, I don't know that you'll have a great union, but I don't think the cost will be as great as many people assume.
I couldn't have said it better, so I'll be very brief, which is only to say that I think one of the reasons I'm a little more skeptical than most people about spending on defense is that I think money doesn't grow on trees. You always have to make choices in politics about what you're going to spend on, and that means making choices about which threats you're going to address. And I think Europe's comparative advantage is working in these kinds of areas and really being the conscious of the world, but also promoting its own interests by doing this. So I think it would be a very sad thing if we went into the 20th century and the Europe 21st century, 21st century, and Europe adapted to what people call a sort of geopolitical century by becoming just like everybody else. Europe stands for something in the world, it stands for something at home, and the reason to be doing things like promoting economic growth or promoting power around the world is to be able to realize those values at home and abroad, not just for Europe, but for humanity. So I do think this is a critical challenge for Europe. And I say that as an American who's aware, for example, that my digital privacy rights are dependent on European regulation and not American regulation. I don't want a 21st century that's all China or all US.
Okay, thank you so much.
We can agree on that.
We've had a very rich, lively, enlightening discussion, even though very often we veered towards the dismal. But I think it's better be prepared than be ignorant. So we are very much grateful to both Anne-Marie Slaughter and Andy Moravcsik for their contribution. Hope to see them back in Athens soon. And thank you all for being here. Thank you. And good night.